The dust of the high plains settled on her like a second skin, a gritty shroud for a life she no longer recognized. Lynn stepped down from the stagecoach, her hand clutching the worn handle of a single suitcase that held the meager remnants of her past. The town of Redemption was a cruel irony, a single sun-bleached street gasping between barren hills. Her dress, a light blue prairie gown her mother had sewn for a future that would never come, was a whisper of color in a world of brown and gray. It marked her as other, as fragile, as something to be stared at. And they stared. Faces in saloon doorways, eyes peering from behind dusty window panes, all of them passing a silent, damning judgment. She was 20 years old, and her life had been traded for a debt she didn't incur, a punishment for a will that refused to break for the man who called himself her father. A man in a dusty coat with a tarnished star pinned to his chest, Deputy Finch, approached her. He didn't offer a greeting, only a curt nod toward the edge of town. "He's waiting," the deputy said, his voice as dry as the dirt beneath her feet. Lynn followed his gaze. There, standing apart from the town, from everything, was a figure that seemed carved from the mountain itself. He was huge, a giant of a man whose shoulders blocked out a portion of the horizon. His hair and beard were long and untamed, a wild mane the color of dark earth, and the sheer muscular breadth of him was intimidating, a promise of raw, untempered strength. This was Jasper, her husband. The whispers of the townsfolk followed her like biting flies. A savage, a beast, a fitting penance for a disobedient daughter. She felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. This wasn't a marriage, it was an execution of the soul, and the mountain was to be her tomb. He did not speak a word. Jasper simply took the suitcase from her trembling hand, his own calloused fingers engulfing hers for a brief, startling moment. The weight of it seemed like nothing to him. He turned and began to walk, expecting her to follow. The path led away from the last vestiges of Redemption and climbed into the foothills, a rugged trail of rock and twisted roots. Each step was a labor, her thin shoes, made for paved city streets, slipping and catching on the unforgiving ground. The sun beat down, and the silence between them was a heavy, suffocating blanket. She watched his back, a wall of muscle that moved with an unnerving, fluid grace. He was an animal of this place, perfectly at home in the wilderness that was already tearing at her spirit. All the stories she'd been told, all the fears that had festered during the long journey west, coalesced into a single, terrifying question. What kind of man lived so far from humanity? What had he done to be so ostracized? Her father's parting words echoed in her mind, laced with venom and triumph. "He will break you where I could not." The air grew cooler as they ascended, the scent of dust giving way to the rich, loamy smell of pine and damp earth. The trees closed in around them, their high branches knitting together to block out the sky, plunging the trail into a deep, primal twilight. Her fear was a living thing now, a cold knot in her stomach. This man, this silent giant, was leading her to the end of the world, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the undergrowth sent a fresh jolt of panic through her. She was a lamb being led to a wolf's den. The cabin appeared suddenly in a small clearing, as if it had grown from the ground itself. It was made of dark, sturdy logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the evening air. It was simple, solid, and utterly isolated. Jasper pushed the heavy door open and stood aside, a silent gesture for her to enter. Lynn hesitated on the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside, a fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light across the single main room. It was shockingly clean. The floor was swept, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a shelf of neatly arranged tins and jars lined one wall. It was the sparsely furnished home of a solitary man, yet it held an orderliness that defied the image of the savage she had constructed in her mind. He walked past her, placing her suitcase on the floor beside a closed door she hadn't noticed. He gestured toward it. "This is yours," he said. His voice, the first she had heard from him, was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It was not unkind. He did not follow her as she hesitantly pushed the door open. The room was small, containing only a narrow bed with a thick, neatly folded quilt, a small crate for a nightstand, and a single window looking out into the dense forest. It was a room of her own, a sanctuary. Later, as she lay stiffly on the cot, she watched the sliver of light under the door. She could hear him moving in the main room, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards, the scrape of a chair. Then she heard the rustle of a bedroll being unfurled, not in a bed, but on the floor near the hearth. He was giving her the only private space he had. He was sleeping on the floor. The shocking plan she had braced herself for, one of cruelty and dominance, had not materialized. In its place was this quiet, inexplicable act of decency. Lying in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the lonely cry of a distant owl, Lynn felt not relief, but a profound and unsettling confusion. The days that followed fell into a pattern of shared silence. Jasper would rise before the sun, the soft sounds of his movements a gentle alarm clock, the sharp crack of his axe splitting firewood, the scrape of a bucket being drawn from the well, the quiet tread of his boots as he left to check his trap lines. These became the markers of her morning. He never spoke to her, never demanded anything of her. He would leave food on the table, a bowl of hearty stew or a portion of whatever he had cooked for himself, before disappearing into the woods for hours. At first, Lynn remained confined to her small room, a prisoner of her own fear and uncertainty. But the silence was a vacuum, and her own spirit, resilient and restless, began to push back against it. She started by sweeping the floor of the cabin, the simple, repetitive motion a small act of defiance against the inertia of despair. Then, venturing outside, she discovered a small, neglected garden patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds. She began to clear it, her hands sinking into the cool, dark soil. It was grounding work, honest work. She found forgotten seeds in a tin on a shelf and began to coax new life from the earth. They existed in parallel orbits, two solitary souls sharing a small patch of the world. Their communication was a language of actions. He would leave a freshly caught fish cleaned and ready by the well. She would mend a tear in his shirt and leave it folded on his chair. He would find a bucket of wild raspberries on the table when he returned one evening. The next morning, a new, sturdier pair of gardening gloves would be sitting beside her door. One afternoon, she stumbled while carrying a sack of flour, sending a white cloud billowing through the cabin. She froze, expecting anger, a reprimand. Jasper simply came over, took the broom from its hook, and began to sweep the mess into a neat pile without a single word, his movements calm and efficient. This quiet, steady kindness was more disarming than any cruelty could have been. A storm broke over the mountain one night, a violent tempest of wind and rain that seemed intent on tearing their small cabin from its foundations. Thunder exploded overhead, rattling the very logs of the walls, and flashes of lightning bleached the world white for a heart-stopping second. A primal fear, one she hadn't felt since she was a small child hiding from her father's rages, seized Lynn. She sat huddled on her bed, trembling, her hands pressed over her ears. The door to her room creaked open. Jasper stood there, a massive silhouette against the firelight from the main room. He didn't speak, but he saw her terror. He stepped back and began to build up the fire in the hearth, adding logs until it blazed, pushing back the shadows and filling the cabin with a comforting, radiant warmth. He then sat at the table, pulled a lantern close, and took out a set of leatherworking tools. Under the steady golden light, he began to work, his enormous calloused hands moving with an almost impossible gentleness and precision. He stitched a seam on a worn leather pouch, his movements focused and serene. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin there was only the crackle of the fire and the soft, rhythmic scrape of his tools. His calm presence became a bulwark against the chaos, a quiet anchor in the storm of her fear. She watched him, mesmerized. This was not the work of a brute. It was the patient craft of a man who understood detail, who valued care. Her eyes drifted to a shelf above the hearth, where a thick, leather-bound ledger lay beside a few worn books. She had seen it before, but had been too afraid to look closely. Now, in the flickering light, she could just make out the writing on its open page. It was not a crude scrawl, but a neat, precise script, the letters perfectly formed, the columns of numbers meticulously aligned. The mystery of him deepened, another layer of the savage myth stripped away. Who was this man of the mountain, who could soothe a storm with fire and silence? Weeks turned into a month, and the sharp edges of summer began to soften into the promise of autumn. The rhythm of their life was as steady as a heartbeat. One morning, Lynn found Jasper by the creek, hunched over something small and fragile. It was a sparrow with a broken wing. He was carefully splinting the tiny limb with a twig and a strip of cloth, his brow furrowed in concentration. His fingers, which could split a log with a single blow, were impossibly tender. Without thinking, she went back to the cabin, filled a small bowl with water, and brought it to him with a clean rag. He looked up, and for the first time she met his gaze directly. His eyes were not the cold, hard chips of stone she had imagined, but a clear, deep gray, and they held a profound and weary sadness. "Thank you," he said. The two words were a low rumble, the sound of a voice long unused, but there was a warmth in them that startled her to her core. It was the first time he had spoken to her since that first day. The word hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their silence. A few days later she found a piece of birch bark on the table. Sketched on it in charcoal was a simple map of the woods nearby, with a small circle drawn around a thicket. An invitation. She followed the map and found a grove bursting with late-season blackberries, heavy and dark on the vine. She filled her basket, her heart feeling strangely light. That evening, as she washed the berries, she found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "Why?" she asked softly, her back still to him. She did not need to elaborate. He was silent for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her as he looked past her, out the window, toward the distant, hazy smudge of the town below. "A debt," he finally answered, his voice quiet but firm. The words settled in the small cabin, heavy with unspoken history. He owed a debt. This wasn't a marriage born of malice or punishment. It was a transaction of a different, more complicated kind. The shocking plan was not to break her, but to keep her. But why? The need for supplies eventually grew unavoidable. Salt, flour, lamp oil. Lynn, bolstered by a fragile new confidence, decided she would go to town alone. The thought was daunting, but the idea of hiding on the mountain forever felt like a different kind of prison. She put on the same light blue dress, now faded and worn, and walked the long trail down to Redemption. The town looked the same, dusty, tired, judgmental. She walked into the general store, the bell above the door announcing her arrival. A woman with kind eyes and graying hair, Martha, stood behind the counter. She watched Lynn with a cautious curiosity but served her without comment. As Lynn was counting out her coins, the door swung open again, and Deputy Finch stepped inside, his presence immediately sucking the warmth from the room. His eyes landed on Lynn, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Well, look what the mountain cat dragged in," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the few other customers to hear. "Does he let you off your leash now and then?" The words were a physical blow, sharp and humiliating. The heat of shame crept up her neck, and the old fear, the one that made her feel small and powerless, returned with a vengeance. She froze, her eyes fixed on the countertop, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. But then another voice cut through the tense silence. "She's a customer, deputy," Martha said, her tone quiet but unyielding. "Paying for her goods, same as any other." It wasn't a shout, but it was a shield. The deputy grunted, his amusement soured, and after a moment he turned and left. Lynn looked at Martha, her heart swelling with a gratitude so intense it almost brought tears to her eyes. The older woman simply gave her a small, tight nod, a silent acknowledgment of shared decency in a town that had so little of it. Lynn left the store, her supplies in her basket, her head held a little higher. The town was still a place of cruelty, but she had discovered an ally. She was not entirely alone. A traveling postman, a rare sight on their remote trail, delivered a letter one afternoon. The crisp envelope, bearing the familiar, arrogant script of her father, felt like a snake in her hand. Her heart sank as she read the words. He was coming to inspect the arrangement and ensure his will had been done. The letter was a declaration of war on the fragile peace she had built. All the progress she had made, the tentative sense of safety she had begun to feel in the quiet cabin, evaporated in an instant. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She crumpled the letter, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Jasper, returning from the woods, found her like that, staring at the wall, her face pale with dread. He saw the crumpled paper on the floor. He picked it up, smoothed it out, and read it. His expression did not change, but a muscle in his jaw tightened, a subtle, dangerous shift in the landscape of his face. He said nothing. He simply folded the letter, placed it on the mantelpiece, and went about his evening chores. But the silence in the cabin that night was different. It was not the comfortable quiet of routine. It was the tense, charged silence before a storm. A few days later, a fine carriage, absurdly out of place, rolled into Redemption. Jasper, who must have been watching the trail from a high vantage point, came into the cabin. He looked at Lynn, a question in his eyes. She simply nodded. For the first time, they walked down the mountain together, not as captor and captive, but as something else, something undefined but allied. They stopped in the middle of the dusty main street. He stood there, an immovable force of nature, his presence a silent challenge. Lynn stood slightly behind him, drawing strength from his stillness. Her father, a portly man in a fine suit, emerged from the deputy's office, flanked by Finch. His face, when he saw them, was a mask of smug satisfaction. He thought he had won. "You!" her father bellowed, his voice thin and reedy in the open air as he pointed a fat finger at Jasper. "The deal was you would break her, tame her wild spirit for a proper husband." The whole town had stopped to watch. Faces peered from every window and doorway, hungry for the drama. Jasper did not move. He simply looked at the smaller man, his gray eyes cold as river stones. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a shout, but it carried with its own power a deep resonance that silenced every other sound on the street. "The deal," Jasper said, his words clear and deliberate, "was that I would keep her safe." A murmur went through the crowd. Her father's face clouded with confusion and anger. "My father," Jasper continued, his gaze unwavering, "trusted you as a partner. You ruined him, took his land, and left him with nothing. He died of a broken heart and an empty stomach. Your debt was to him. You offered me money. I refused. So you offered me your daughter, a thing to be owned, to be broken as payment." The shameful truth of it hung in the air, ugly and exposed. The townspeople looked from Jasper to Lynn's father, their expressions shifting from curiosity to contempt. "I took her," Jasper said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly as he glanced back at Lynn, "to give her sanctuary from you." He then reached into his coat and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He held it out, not to her father, but to Lynn. "You are not a payment," he said, his voice for her alone now. "You are not a prisoner. You are free. This is enough for a ticket to anywhere you want to go. You can leave with him, or you can leave alone. The choice is yours. The pouch of gold coins glinted in the sunlight. It was freedom, offered freely by the man she had once believed to be her jailer. Every eye in redemption was on her. Her father's face was purple with rage, his cruelest weapon, her future, now turned against him. Her life balanced on a single, silent choice. Lynn looked at the pouch of gold, then at the road leading out of town. A path to a life she could have, a life of anonymity and escape. Then she looked at her father, and for the first time she saw him not as a figure of terror, but as a small, pathetic man, his power built on the fear of others. He was nothing. Finally, she turned her eyes to Jasper. She saw the quiet strength that had shielded her, the unexpected gentleness that had given her space to heal. She saw the man who tended a sparrow's broken wing, who spoke in actions instead of words, who had absorbed the town's scorn and her father's malice to honor a debt in his own way, by protecting the innocent. He had not tamed her spirit. He had given it a place to grow. She took a step forward, not toward the pouch of gold, but toward him. She walked past her sputtering father, past the stunned face of Deputy Finch, and past the silent, watching townspeople. She came to a stop beside Jasper, turning to face the town with him, a united front. She did not take the coins. She looked up at the man who had been her keeper, her guardian, her silent companion. "My home," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a certainty that came from the very core of her being, "is on the mountain." It was a choice. It was a declaration. It was the sound of a life being reclaimed. A quiet gasp went through the crowd. Her father's face contorted in a mask of impotent fury. Without another word, Jasper turned. Lynn fell into step beside him. Together, they left the main street, their backs to the town, to the past, to the man who no longer had any claim on her. They walked back up the familiar trail, the silence between them no longer one of uncertainty, but of deep and mutual understanding. The air on the mountain path felt different, lighter, filled with the clean scent of pine and possibility. The cabin, when it came into view, was no longer a refuge from fear, but a destination. It was home. They reached the clearing as the sun began to set, bathing the world in a warm, golden light that promised a peaceful end to a tumultuous day. The future was unwritten, a blank page waiting for a new story. But for the first time she knew, with every fiber of her being, that it would be theirs to write together.